The air in the salty dog was a thick, breathing thing, heavy with the ghosts of spilled beer, stale cigarette smoke, and the sweat of 100 nights of loud stories. It was a place just outside the wire of Camp Lejeune, a decompression chamber where the rigid postures of military life were allowed to slump, but where the hierarchies, unspoken and primal, remained fiercely intact. Heat clung to the wooden walls like a wet uniform, the overworked air conditioner rattling a desperate losing battle against the humid North Carolina night. The room was a sea of high and tight haircuts, tattooed forearms, and the restless, coiled energy of young men trained for violence, now temporarily becalmed by cheap lager and the promise of the weekend. At the center of this restless ocean, holding court from a bar stool like a king on a precarious throne, was Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a man built of surplus parts from a battleship, a barrel chest that strained the fabric of his polo shirt, a neck as thick as a mortar tube, and hands that looked like they could crush granite into dust. His voice was a geological event, a low rumble that started in his boots and came out as a gravelly cascade, forcing all other conversations in the bar to ebb into respectful silence. He was telling a story, a grand and almost certainly embellished tale of a bar fight in Okinawa, and his audience, a rapt chorus of some 20 Marines, mostly young privates and lance corporals who saw him as a titan, hung on every word. They laughed when he paused for laughter, their heads bobbing in unison like a field of sunflowers tracking their sun. His sycophant-in-chief, a wiry corporal named Davies with weaselly eyes, was perched closest, his face a mask of perpetual fawning amusement. To Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, the world was a simple and satisfyingly linear equation. It was a ladder. On the bottom rungs were the weak, the quiet, the hesitant. On the top rungs were the strong, the loud, the decisive. He, Marcus Thorne, was built for climbing. He had mistaken volume for authority and presence for power, for so long that the two had become inextricably fused in his mind. His ego was a carefully constructed edifice, built block by block from the deference of his subordinates, the fear of his rivals, and the thunder of his own voice. He believed respect was a resource to be demanded, taken by force if necessary, and that silence in his presence was a vacuum that it was his duty to fill. Weakness, in his brutally simple calculus, was a form of disrespect. It was an insult to his strength, a failure to properly acknowledge the hierarchy he embodied, and it had to be corrected, loudly and publicly. He was the hammer, and the world was full of nails waiting to be put in their place. Tonight, he was enjoying the familiar, satisfying weight of his own importance, the feeling of being the biggest, loudest thing in the room. It was a feeling he chased relentlessly, the only anesthetic that truly soothed the quiet, gnawing fear of insignificance that lived deep in the core of his being. Then, through the haze of smoke and self-regard, he saw her. She was an anomaly, a disruption in the physics of his universe. At the far end of the long, sticky bar, tucked into the corner where the shadows pooled like dark water, sat a woman. She was not, in any conventional sense, remarkable. She was small-framed, wearing a simple gray hoodie with the hood down and worn jeans. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun, revealing a face that was plain and unadorned. She was an island of profound stillness in his sea of restless energy, a pocket of absolute silence in the storm of his voice. He had been vaguely aware of her for the last hour, a peripheral shape he had dismissed as insignificant. But now, his story finished, and the laughter of his disciples fading, his attention snagged on her with the force of a grappling hook. She was engaged in a task of meticulous, almost monastic focus. On the bar in front of her was a clean white cloth, and upon it lay the disassembled components of what looked like a complex pair of shooting glasses. With the delicate precision of a watchmaker, she was cleaning each lens, each screw, each tiny piece of the frame with a smaller cloth and a small bottle of solution. Her movements were economical and fluid, each one flowing into the next with an unnerving lack of wasted energy. She did not look up. She did not seem to hear the raucous laughter or the booming cadence of his voice. She simply existed in her own sphere of concentration, a place so self-contained and serene that it felt like a judgment on the chaos that surrounded her. Thorne watched her, a frown creasing his brow. His internal lexicon, the one he used to categorize the world, had no file for this. She was not flirting. She was not trying to get his attention. She was not intimidated. She was simply there. And her stillness was not the timid stillness of a mouse hiding from a cat. It was the stillness of a mountain. It had weight, it had presence. It absorbed the sound he made, leaving nothing but a strange, ringing silence in its wake. He felt an unfamiliar prickle of irritation. Her quiet was a challenge. Her focus on her task was a form of disrespect. In his kingdom of noise, her silence was an act of rebellion. He saw her unassuming posture, her plain clothes, her focused work, and his mind translated it all through its crude filter. He saw weakness. He saw a nail that was not only out of place but was flagrantly refusing to be hammered down. "Look at that," Thorne grumbled, his voice low but carrying easily to his entourage. He nudged Corporal Davies with his elbow, gesturing with his chin toward the end of the bar. "Lost, little bird?" Davies, ever the echo, squinted and then snickered on cue. "Looks like someone from the library wandered in, Gunny. Probably thinks this is a book club." The chorus of young Marines chuckled, the sound ragged and eager. The joke was not funny, but the source of the joke was their gunnery sergeant, and so they laughed. The sound was a wave designed to wash over the woman, to pull her out of her quiet world and into theirs, to force her to acknowledge the king. But the wave broke against her stillness and receded, leaving her untouched. She did not flinch, did not look up. The only sign she had heard was a fractional pause in the polishing of a lens, a hesitation so slight it was almost imperceptible. This, for Thorne, was the final straw. The edifice of his ego, so grand and imposing, was in truth a brittle shell, and it had just been struck by the tiny, sharp hammer of her indifference. His irritation curdled into a hot public anger. He could not allow this. He could not allow his authority, his very presence, to be so thoroughly and quietly ignored. It was a stain on his honor in front of his men. He would make her see him. He would make her acknowledge the hierarchy. He slid off his stool, the heavy thud of his boots on the floorboards announcing his intent. The Marines around him shifted, their amusement turning to a tense anticipation. They knew what was coming. They had seen the Gunny correct people before. It was a performance, a piece of theater designed to reinforce his dominance, and they were the loyal audience. Thorne swaggered down the length of the bar, Corporal Davies trailing in his wake like a pilot fish. The other patrons of the Salty Dog fell silent, their conversations dying as they sensed the shift in the bar's atmosphere. A predator was on the move. The air grew thick with a greasy, expectant tension. Thorne stopped directly behind her, his large frame casting her in a deep shadow. He was close enough that she should have been able to feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the stale beer on his breath. He loomed over her, a mountain of muscle and indignation, waiting for her to shrink, to turn, to show fear. She did not. She continued her task, beginning the careful reassembly of the glasses. Her hands were steady, her focus absolute. "Hey!" Thorne's voice was a low growl, meant to intimidate. "I'm talking to you." She paused her work but did not turn. In the profound silence of the bar, her voice when it came was shockingly quiet, flat, and devoid of any emotion. It was not a voice, so much as a simple transmission of data. The system was throwing an error. Thorne blinked. The response was so far outside the expected script of fear or supplication that it momentarily confused him. "The what? What the hell are you talking about?" She finally turned her head, just enough to look at him out of the corner of her eye. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, and they held the placid calm of a frozen lake. They registered his presence, analyzed it, and dismissed it in the space of a heartbeat. "The optics," she said, her voice still a monotone. "The polarization filter was misaligned. It was causing a parallax distortion." The technical jargon was another offense. It was a language he did not speak, and he interpreted it as a deliberate attempt to mock him, to make him feel stupid. His face flushed a dark, mottled red. Corporal Davies snickered behind him, a sound like a weasel choking. "Parallax distortion? Listen to you, little librarian. You're in a Marine bar, sweetheart, not a science fair. Around here, we expect a little respect for the uniform." He puffed out his chest, though he was in civilian clothes. It was the idea of the uniform, the authority it represented, that he felt was being slighted. "I am not your sweetheart," she stated, the words as clean and precise as the components on the cloth before her. She turned back to her work, the finality of the gesture a clear dismissal. A collective gasp went through the younger Marines. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. No one spoke to Gunnery Sergeant Thorne like that. No one. Thorne himself looked as if she had physically struck him. His jaw worked silently for a moment, his mind struggling to process the absolute lack of fear, the total absence of deference. He was the irresistible force, and he had just met an object that was not just immovable, but seemed utterly unaware that he was even pushing. His rage, now untethered from reason, boiled over. He needed to touch her, to physically impose his will on her, to prove through force what his presence alone could not. "That's it," he snarled, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. "You need to be taught a lesson, lady, a lesson in respect." His hand, a slab of meat and bone, shot out and clamped down on her shoulder. It was a gesture of ownership, of dominance. It was meant to spin her around, to force her to face him, to make her small body feel the brute reality of his strength. He squeezed, expecting her to cry out, to struggle, to finally show the terror he felt was his due. He was prepared for tears, for pleas, for a desperate, flailing struggle. He was not prepared for what happened next. Crack. The sound was not loud, but it was sharp and crystalline, like a branch snapping in a frozen forest. It cut through the bar's thick silence with the finality of a guillotine. The moment his fingers tightened on her shoulder, she moved. It was not a large movement. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of weight, a slight rotation of her torso, and a fluid drop of her center of gravity. Her left hand, which had been assembling the delicate frame of her glasses, came up in a blur. It did not strike him. It met his wrist, not with force, but with a kind of gentle, guiding precision. Her fingers, small and slender, found the exact intersection of bone and nerve with the unerring accuracy of a surgeon. Her thumb pressed a single point on the underside of his forearm. It was a preparatory ritual, a series of micro-adjustments that lasted less than a second, but felt to the stunned onlookers like an eternity of slow motion. To Thorne, it felt as though she had plugged a live wire directly into his nervous system. The impossible feat was not one of strength, but of physics. She did not fight his crushing grip. She accepted it, redirected it, and amplified it. Using his own forward momentum and the massive force he was exerting, she turned his strength into a weapon against himself. With that single, precise pressure point engaged, and with the subtle pivot of her body, she torqued his entire arm in a way it was never meant to bend. His grip on her shoulder became the fulcrum, and his own body became the lever. The sharp crack was the sound of the two smallest bones in his wrist, the lunate and the triquetrum, grinding together under a pressure they could not withstand. An agony, unlike anything he had ever known, not in training, not in combat, erupted from his wrist and shot up his arm like a bolt of white-hot lightning. A strangled gasp escaped his lips, a pathetic, strangled sound that was nothing like his usual roar. His leg, suddenly disconnected from his brain's commands, buckled. He found himself on his knees on the filthy floor of the bar, his massive body contorted in a posture of complete submission. His hand was still on her shoulder, but it was no longer a grip of dominance. It was the desperate anchor of a drowning man. She held his wrist in her small hand, her grip now feeling like it was forged from steel, pinning him in place. She looked down at him, her expression unchanged. There was no triumph in her eyes, no anger, no satisfaction. There was only the calm, dispassionate curiosity of a mechanic observing a malfunctioning engine. "You were given one chance," she said, her voice the same quiet, flat monotone. The statement hung in the air, an epitaph for his arrogance. The aftermath was a silence so profound, it felt like the world had lost its sound. The 20 Marines of the chorus stood frozen, their mouths agape, their faces masks of slack-jawed disbelief. The scene was impossible. Their gunny, their titan, their god of noise and strength, was kneeling on the floor, brought low by a single, silent touch from a woman half his size. Corporal Davies had taken a half-step back, his face pale, his weaselly eyes wide with a terror that was almost comical. The carefully constructed edifice of Thorne's worldview had not just been cracked, it had been vaporized, reduced to dust and blown away in the space of a single heartbeat. Then, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, she released his wrist. Thorne crumpled forward, clutching his arm to his chest, a low, guttural moan of pain finally escaping his throat. She turned back to the bar, picked up the last component of her glasses, and clicked it into place with a soft, final ping. She slid them on, her movements as calm and unhurried as they had been before. The storm had passed, and she was once again the eye, an island of perfect, unshakable calm. If you believe that true strength is quiet until it is needed, type "still waters" in the comments. The heavy front door of the Salty Dog swung open, letting in a slice of the humid night air and the silhouette of a man. The figure stepped inside, and the bar's oppressive tension immediately ratcheted up to a new, unbearable level. This was a different kind of authority. It was not loud or performative. It was an ambient pressure, a change in the room's gravitational field. Every Marine in the room, from the petrified Corporal Davies to the stunned lance corporals in the back, instinctively straightened their spines. Their training, buried under layers of beer and bravado, surged to the surface. Shoulders went back, chins came up. A silent, reflexive wave of attention swept the room. The man was Colonel Jennings. He wore his uniform, the silver eagle on his collar gleaming in the dim light. He was a tall, lean man with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by barroom theatrics. His presence dwarfed Thorne's bluster, rendering it childish and pathetic. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance: the stunned recruits, the pale-faced corporal, the gunnery sergeant on the floor cradling his arm, and the quiet woman at the bar now calmly sipping a glass of water. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, lingered on the woman, and a flicker of something unreadable, recognition, and perhaps a deep, weary respect, crossed his face. He walked forward, his polished boots making no sound on the dusty floorboards. He stopped beside the kneeling gunnery sergeant. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. His words were cold, precise, and carried the weight of a court-martial. "Gunnery Sergeant Thorne." Thorne looked up, his face a mess of pain, humiliation, and dawning horror. "Sir," he croaked, scrambling to get to his feet, a fresh wave of agony making him wince. "On the floor is not where I expect to find my senior non-commissioned officers, Gunny," the colonel said, his voice dangerously soft. "Especially not in front of junior Marines. You are a disgrace to your rank, to my command, and to the uniform you represent. You mistake your volume for leadership and your ego for strength. You are a bully and a fool, and you have just made the single greatest mistake of your career." The public rebuke was devastating. Each word was a perfectly placed blow, dismantling what little remained of Thorne's authority. The young Marines stared at the floor, the walls, anywhere but at their fallen idol. The vicarious shame was a palpable force in the room. Colonel Jennings then turned his attention from the broken man on the floor and faced the woman at the bar. His entire demeanor shifted. The cold, cutting anger was replaced by a profound, almost reverential gravity. He stood straighter, if that were possible, and his voice, when he spoke to her, was low and formal. "Chief Warrant Officer 5 Vance, I did not expect to see you here." A murmur went through the room. Chief Warrant Officer 5. The rank was almost mythical, a unicorn in the command structure, reserved for the absolute masters of a technical craft, operators with decades of experience at the highest, most classified levels. It was a rank that commanded more respect in certain circles than that of a general. The woman, Vance, gave a slight nod. "Colonel, just passing through, calibrating some new equipment." The colonel's eyes drifted to the glasses she wore. He nodded slowly, a universe of understanding passing between them. He then turned back to the utterly bewildered assembly of Marines. His voice became that of a historian, a storyteller reciting a sacred text. "Let me tell you who you just watched your gunnery sergeant assault," he began, his voice ringing with an authority that was absolute. "This is Chief Vance. To most of the world, she doesn't exist. She has no public file, no official commendations, but in the places where the real work gets done, she is a legend. They call her Wraith." He paused, letting the call sign sink in. It was a name whispered in awe by Tier 1 operators, a ghost story told to frighten new intelligence analysts. "Ashi." "This woman," the colonel continued, his gaze sweeping over the young, dumbstruck faces, "was one of the architects of the Ghost Protocol network. She has operated alone in places your maps don't even show. The shrapnel scar above her eye is from a bombing in Kandahar that she was the sole survivor of, because she had already neutralized the threat before the building came down on top of her. The burn marks on her left forearm are from disabling a dirty bomb in Jakarta with 2 seconds on the clock. She has more confirmed, classified kills with a blade than your entire platoon has with rifles. She does not hold a rank that you can comprehend, because her value is not measured in stripes or bars. It is measured in the lives she has saved, and the wars you never knew happened because she stopped them before they began." The recitation of her deeds fell into the stunned silence of the bar. It was too much to process. The quiet librarian, the little bird, was a figure of myth, a walking ghost of modern warfare. The 20 Marines looked at her now, not with curiosity or contempt, but with a deep and profound awe that bordered on religious fear. They were looking at a living monument, Colonel Jennings took one step forward, planting himself directly in front of her. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. His hand came up in a salute so sharp, so precise, so full of genuine, unadorned respect that it seemed to vibrate with energy. It was not the perfunctory salute given to a superior officer. It was the ultimate gesture of respect from one warrior to another, an acknowledgement of a power and a sacrifice that transcended rank. The woman, Vance, simply gave another small, quiet nod. The salute was an offering, and she accepted it with the same calm indifference with which she had accepted Thorne's assault. The fate of Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne was sealed in that moment. His career was not just over, it was annihilated. He was escorted from the bar by 2 military police officers the colonel had summoned, a broken man stripped of his pride, his rank, and the entire foundation of his identity. He offered no resistance. The bluster and rage were gone, replaced by a hollow, vacant shock. The brittle shell of his ego had been shattered, and there was nothing left inside but a small, frightened man who had just learned the universe was infinitely larger and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The chorus of 20 Marines remained frozen in place long after the colonel and the military police had departed with Thorne. Their worldview had been permanently rewired. The simple ladder of strength they had believed in had been kicked out from under them, replaced by a complex, terrifying new geometry. They now understood that the most dangerous thing in the room was not the loudest. They looked at the woman at the bar who was now gathering her cleaning cloth, her movements still patient and precise. They saw her not as a woman, but as a force of nature, a quiet storm they had been spared from. Their youthful arrogance had been scoured away, replaced by a humbling, chilling lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Vance folded her cloth into a neat square and placed it in a small pouch. She left a few dollars on the bar to cover her water, her final action, a mundane courtesy in the wake of mythic revelation. She slid off the stool and walked toward the door, her footsteps silent. As she passed the group of stunned Marines, she paused for a moment beside a young private whose dog had been injured during a training exercise earlier that week. "Check his paws for glass," she said, her voice the same flat monotone. "The training ground is littered with it." Then she was gone, disappearing into the humid Carolina night as quietly as she had appeared, leaving behind a legend and a bar full of changed men. The story of that night in the Salty Dog spread through Camp Lejeune like wildfire. It became a piece of institutional folklore, a cautionary tale told in whispers by grizzled master sergeants to cocky new lieutenants. The tale of Thorne's folly, as it came to be known, was a lesson in humility, a stark reminder that one should never, ever judge the lethality of a weapon by its size or its silence. The legend of Wraith became a specter that haunted the base, a symbol of the unseen, unheralded competence that formed the true backbone of the armed forces. It was a story that taught a generation of Marines that the loudest man in the room is often the most insecure, and that true confidence does not need to announce itself. Years later, on a dusty training range in Quantico, a new class of recruits was being instructed on situational awareness. Their instructor was a man named Marcus Thorne. He was older now, leaner, the arrogant swagger long gone, replaced by a quiet, weary gravity. His right wrist had a faint silvery scar, and he sometimes rubbed it unconsciously when he was making a point. He never raised his voice. He taught his students to observe, to listen, to assess, to understand that threats rarely announce themselves with a roar. "Your ego is a liability," he would tell them, his voice low and raspy. "It will make you blind to the things that can actually hurt you. The most dangerous person in the room is the one you don't notice, the one who is quiet, the one who is watching. Never, ever mistake silence for weakness." He was a good instructor. He taught the most important lesson of his life, a lesson he had been forced to learn in the most humiliating way imaginable. And in doing so, he found a measure of redemption. And what of the woman known as Wraith? Her epilogue is one of continued silence. She was never seen at Lejeune again. Perhaps she was in a server room deep beneath a desert, recalibrating a satellite uplink. Perhaps she was in a crowded bazaar in a forgotten corner of the world, tracking a target through the noise and chaos. Or perhaps she was simply at home, in a small, anonymous apartment, meticulously cleaning her glasses, her focus absolute, indifferent to the legend she had created. Her life was not defined by the dramatic confrontation in the bar, but by the quiet, thankless, and monumentally important work she did in the shadows. She was a guardian who sought no recognition, a master professional whose reward was simply the successful completion of the task. There is a fundamental truth about the nature of strength that our world, with its incessant noise and demand for performance, often encourages us to forget. We are taught to equate strength with volume, with visibility, with the aggressive occupation of space. We build our identities like fortresses with high walls and loud cannons, broadcasting our power to ward off any potential challengers. This is the strength of the shell. Brittle, hollow, and designed entirely for external validation. It is loud because it is terrified of the silence. It is large because it is terrified of its own emptiness. It demands respect because it has not earned it, and it fears, above all else, being ignored, for to be ignored is to be revealed as insignificant. This was the fortress of Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, a grand edifice that crumbled to dust at the first touch of genuine power. True strength, the strength of the core, is an entirely different entity. It is not built for display. It is forged in silence, honed by discipline, and tempered by experience. It has no need for validation from others, for it is self-contained and self-aware. It does not broadcast its power, it simply possesses it. It is quiet, for it has nothing to prove. It is still, for it is in perfect balance. It seeks not to dominate, but to understand. It does not demand respect. It commands it effortlessly by its very nature. This was the strength of the woman called Wraith. Her power was not in her muscles, but in her focus, not in her voice, but in her knowledge, not in her anger, but in her calm. She was the embodiment of the principle that the most profound forces in the universe, gravity, time, the tectonic shifting of the earth, are silent, patient, and irresistible. The story is a lesson then, not just for soldiers in a bar, but for all of us. It is a reminder to look past the performance, to listen beneath the noise, and to recognize that the world is full of quiet masters and loud fools. It teaches us that humility is not weakness, but the beginning of wisdom, and that true respect is reserved not for the loudest voice in the room, but for the most competent hands.